she also gets called out for reading, which is interesting, but her teacher basically tells her, here in our class, we learn to read together. So Scout basically then describes reading by saying she never feared she would lose it. Until I feared I would lose it, I never loved to read, but does not love reading. I just find it so interesting as a reader myself and loving reading this book. I think it's fascinating how she describes reading. And this foreshadows, in a way, some of her struggles from becoming a girl to a young woman, which I think is interesting how, again, Harper Lee does some great foreshadowing in the story between talking about Mockingbird and then in this scene talking about how Scout didn't really love to read until she feared to lose it. And that, again, and is that loss of innocence, which is one of the themes that are explored in the story, is then talked about later when we are introduced to Scout's Aunt Alexandra. So I find that passage very interesting. One of the more mild ones, so it's a lighter note, definitely. But then for passage 10, again, we're introduced to Aunt Alexandria. I'm not going to read the whole one. You can find the whole passage, you can find it on page 133 of the large print version. Sorry again. But basically, Scout talks about how her Aunt Alexandria wants her to be a sunbeam. That's the word she uses. And then she talks about Atticus, too, a little bit on page 133. And she says, and I'm actually going to read it to you because I love it so much. She says, but when I asked Atticus about it, he said there were already enough sunbeams in the family to go on about my business. He didn't mind me much the way I was. And the reason I wrote this passage down, the reason this is my passage 10, is because, again, it's the beginning of the book foreshadowed this already. We already know Scout is dealing with, she's trying to become this girl, this young woman, and by the end of the book she is. But right now she's trying to figure out why everyone wants her to be and she doesn't want to be. And personally, as a girl myself, which probably is why I identified more with Scout, which I mentioned previously, I identified a lot more with Scout than Huckleberry Finn and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, which was a book I had to read quite close to before I read To Kill a Mockingbird. But again, this is one of the reasons I think I identified with Scout so much, is because she dealt with a lot of the same struggles I dealt with as a girl going into a young woman. And the main one was everyone telling me to act a certain way while at the same time telling me to be myself. And that's difficult. And one of the ones I wrote down in my notes was shaving. I remember reading this passage and thinking about shaving. One of the conversations I'll have with my own Aunt Alexandra and is about shaving, because social media and everyone tells you, you don't need to shave your legs, it's so norm now, it's such a norm now to not shave your legs, but yet we see actors with clean shaven legs, and when you go out and about and people are telling us to shave our legs. So, and that's something I don't even know my own feelings about. And when we read this, Scout is telling and trying to process her own feelings about being a young woman, which is difficult. And definitely very much, again, I can't stress this enough, points out that theme of innocence. So, yeah, and I wrote down here, false alarm. I got everything questioned. But just like chapter 26, there's a lot to dissect in chapter 9. Another one of the honorable mentions can actually be found in chapter 9, where they talk about nigger lover on page 141. Again, I think it's interesting how Harper Lee addresses the word nigger. It's much easier to understand and much more clear, I think, especially for a younger audience, compared to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is still a great book, but if you're younger and you're didn't understand Huckleberry Finn, read this one. I think you'll find a lot more you'll be able to dissect and understand this one, especially in our modern age. So, passage 11, which is a lot shorter. After all, if Annie can be a lady at a time like this, so could I. and that was on page 393. I actually want to find it because I found this interesting. So, basically, let me open why Scout says this, because we just read my passage 10. She doesn't want to be a lady. Scout doesn't want to be a lady. But then, closely in the book, when we see her start to mature, she says, if Auntie can be a lady, then so can I. And these are powerful words coming from Scout. She says this right after they find out that Tom Robinson has been killed. And Auntie is worried. And I want to read you what she says because I find it interesting. And Alexandra says, what else do they want from him? What else do they want from Atticus? Maudie, what else? I mean, this town, they're perfectly willing to let him do what they're afraid to. Too afraid to do themselves. I might lose him a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do. Goodness. So yeah, I just sneezed. No big deal. Let's keep going. So, again, Alexandra says they're perfectly willing to let him do what they're too afraid to do themselves. And Alex, clearly in this passage, this was before my passage 11, when she said, if Auntie can be a lady, then so can I. So Auntie is worried, and Scout gets worried. Scout says her knees start to shake. She's like, I am worried. But then Aunt Alexandra composes herself. And because they have guests over, they're having and I forget what it's called, but all the women are meeting and they're talking about where their money should go from the church, basically. It's kind of the conversation. My dog barked again. But anyway, that's the conversation they're having. And so, with the ladies in town, so as she has to compose herself, she has to be a lady to go out and talk to these women, continue the conversation. And Scout watches this. Scout watches as Auntie composes herself and just becomes a woman in just an instant. And Scout suddenly she realizes why it's important to act and be a lady, especially around these guests that she has to serve. So that's when she says, and Auntie lady, and so can I. Again, hugely powerful, and just thought it was so interesting, especially with my struggles as becoming a girl into a young woman. So I thought that was an interesting one, and I really wanted to mention that. So again, I don't think I'm doing this book justice. You need to read it. It is so good. My hair is sticking up. So lastly but not leastly, passage 12. So this can be found on page 123 and 124, and this is the one I mentioned earlier. It's when Atticus is trying to explain his case in Tom Robson's trial to Scout. And he says, because I could never ask you to remind me against Scout simply by the nature of the work. Every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me if you will. Just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't let them get your go. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. So, and this is in chapter 9. Chapter 9 is full of just a lot of information. And this is actually, I think this may be the passage that is right after Scout talks about nigger lover, because she basically is like, why is everyone saying all this weird stuff about my father? And at that time it was normal, but for Scout it was weird. It was odd. It was strange. She was like, why are they? And I think part of the reason because she knew like that's the norm. That's like a normal thing then, but she knew it was bad. Her father's raised her to understand some of the words in the community that aren't right, and she's like, why are they calling my father this? And then she goes and then eventually she has this conversation with him where he explains the trial to her and his case, because it's his case. He's going to be Tom Robinson's main man, his lawyer. So, and it's just interesting because Atticus tells Scout to try fighting with her, and it's also interesting because Atticus tells Scout to try fighting with her head for a change. And this, as we've looked at the other passages, Scout is starting to fight with her head rather than her fists. And it's just interesting. It's very much points out that theme of innocence. And I think it'd even be safe to say that she fights with her head when she says, well, it's sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? So, I love this passage. I don't know really what else to say about it. I just thought it was so interesting, and it's a great, I feel like it was a great passage 12 too, and just, after looking at all the other passages, in passage 11, she realizes why it's important to be a woman, and then in one later passage, she realizes why, well, it's sort of like shooting a mockingbird. So, those are all passages for To Kill a Mockingbird. Again, highly recommend reading it. Don't recommend getting the large book version unless you want to just follow along with my passages. But I encourage you to do a double entry journal yourself, especially on To Kill a Mockingbird, because it's fascinating what you can learn about yourself and what you can put down on paper that you never want people to know. But look at me, I'm doing a video. So I think the biggest thing is, and I wrote it down here, oh man, I can't find so bibliography, I don't know what it's called, had an interesting snippet from their website. So they said, sensitive treatment of a child's awakening to racism and prejudice in the South is what the book basically is, what To Kill a Mockingbird is about. And I think that's so true. I think Harper Lee encourages readers to not let hate overtake them, and she even encourages younger readers to understand the difference between good and evil themselves, like Scout, because it will help them navigate the real world where there are greater sins than just killing a mockingbird. So that is all that I have. That's the end of my double entry journal, and I hope you learned something from this, and I hope you are encouraged to go do a double entry journal yourself, or at least go read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. So goodbye guys, and stay swaggy.